Nuxt server components are here, and I want to tell you more about it. So this exciting new experimental feature through Nuxt has had a lot of momentum. They've had a lot of updates, and I want to explore with you how you can use this in your project today. Now, I've been thinking about different ways of having to show you guys this, so I created a presentation on it. So sit back, let me know what you guys think. Leave a comment below what you think about this presentation style, what you like about it. And so I'll be going over exactly what you should know about server components. Oh, and if you don't know, my name is Eric. I'm a full stack software developer. I work at AWS, and I am a big fan of Nuxt and Vue and React and Next. So if you guys like those things, make sure you click that like and subscribe. Let's jump in. All right, so we're gonna talk about Nuxt server components. So I was really thinking about this topic because I stumbled upon it when I was looking at all this hype I heard about the Next server components. So if you don't know, Next has released Next 13 and Next 14. And one big thing that they've done is they've added in server components. So I wanted to see how this would work on the Nuxt side. So basically on the Vue.js side. And I found out the Nuxt core team has already done an amazing job, and they have already added this feature, but it's a lot different. So the first thing I want to say is that React server components is not the same as Nuxt server components. It's actually almost completely opposite, which I'll get into. But React server components are by default, every single component's a React server component. On the other hand, Nuxt side, it's almost like a feature. So each one of your components, you can kind of choose if you want them to be ran as a server component or not, and something you have to opt in. I keep saying this, but I'll put this warning out. The feature I'm talking about today is experimental, meaning that you should not be using this in production. If you do, you might have some unintended consequences. Leave a comment below if you've used experimental features in a production app before. I think some experimental features are actually okay to use if you understand the risks. And I feel like the same thing with this. So leave a comment below if you've ever done that. I certainly have. And as Austin Powers says, I love to live dangerously. So if you love to live dangerously with me, keep watching the rest of this video because I think you'll learn something and you might want to try it out. Nuxt server components are basically rendered individual components within your client-side app. So they are rendering on the server side inside your application. It's important to understand the different types of rendering modes that Nuxt has and how they relate to each other. So let's go over that quickly and we'll see how that relates to server components. So let's talk first about SSR, or server-side rendering. And this is a mode that you can set inside Nuxt. Now, I wrote this up in Excalidraw. This is my diagram for server-side rendering here. So you have this data is fetched. So you have two kind of states of it. First, while you're first connecting to the server, there's this loading state, and then you have this active state. So at the beginning, the page is loading. It's the server's generating the pages, and it sends the pages in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to the front end. And then the browser displays the page. But one thing that happens is that even though the browser displays the page, it may not be interactive right away. So that might take a moment because what happens in the background is Nuxt.js hydrates with the JavaScript in mind. And at that point, it basically comes like a single page app. So when you change routes, you're changing routes on the client side, not on the server side at that point. But the important thing is that the time to render to show the first paint is much quicker than other apps because you don't have to download all that JavaScript. The server is very quickly creating the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and then displaying it to the user. And then it might take, a half a second for all the JavaScript to hydrate in the background. Which actually makes it interesting because if some users load the page and then really, really quickly try to tap a button, it may not be interactive yet. I haven't even seen any scenarios where that's happened, but that's maybe one downside of server-side rendering. But after it's rendered, you're basically a client-side app. So what about static site generation? This is interesting. This is another mode you can use in Nuxt, but what it can do is it takes every single route that you have it generates all the pages for it beforehand during the build step. Then when your server connects, when your web browser connects, it then just sends the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript down. There's no kind of hydration needed. The page is instantly active. Everything works fine. And this is kind of really nice, especially for sites that have a lot of static information, because then you can have a really quick website. This is great for SEO as well. So what about server rendering? So let's talk about that. So in server rendering, the data is fetched. It's kind of like server-side rendering. The pages are generated. It sends the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and then the browser displays the page and everything's active. There's no hydration happening. You basically have a server-rendered app. If you are an old-school web developer and you used PHP back in the day or any other of those older frameworks, this is essentially how web development was done. Everything was server-rendered. You would have all your page on the server. Every time you move to a different route, a new page would just load. And this is one thing to realize is you can have the server rendering in Nuxt per component. You can maybe have it like the whole page, but it's usually like individual components in your app. You can choose to have them being server rendered, and it doesn't necessarily mean your whole page is. But this is extremely beneficial for you, and we'll look at some scenarios where you may use this server rendering. So goals, why? So we're going to talk about some things we're going to do today. We're going to look at why use server components, Nuxt server components in general, specifically why you may not want to use them, how to set them up, some code examples. We're going to work with slots and fallbacks and some future improvements. So if you're watching this, you're probably thinking, why should you use server components at all? Let's take a look. Well, first, they have a lower bundle size. So anytime you use a server component, let's say you're using some kind of library that talks to a database, or you might be using Lodash or underscore or whatever you're using, all those libraries are typically bundled into your JavaScript bundle that gets downloaded into your app, into the client, into the front end when someone visits your website. If you use something like server components, all that back-end code to connect to different services, all those different libraries now are on the server side. So you don't necessarily, so they actually don't leak into the front end at all. And as you know, as a front end developer, having a lower bundle size is golden, because you know that your users are going to be able to quickly get your site up and running. It's great for SEO. So a huge plus here is to use server components so you can lower that bundle size. By the way, if you're using API routes, you get this benefit as well. So if you had this in API route, it would be doing the same thing, but having it in the component itself kind of puts it closer to where it's being used. Another important thing is that secrets are more secure. So going back to the example that I talked about before about having a database connected, now you know that if you're connecting to your database, you need certain passwords, secrets to connect to the database. And now you know that if you're using server components, those aren't going to be leaked to the front end because they're all on the server side. It's also just easier to organize your code now that your components and your server code are next to each other. Now, some people would debate that's kind of you're mixing too many things together, but you can put those into the separate files, import them in, but it's really nice knowing that your data is secure. And you basically don't need a server. So by the way, I got some of these tips from Daniel Rowe from the Nuxt core team. So I'll make sure I put a shout out and put a link in the description to his work. But basically you don't need a server at all. I didn't know this, but you can compile, if you add a server route, you can compile it and run it as like a static site, and it will Nuxt will automatically look at those server routes and prefetch all the data that you need and put them inside your app. So that's kind of a neat way you can use it. You don't even need a server, which kind of feels wrong because we're talking about server components, but you don't have to have one. And it can be used like any normal component. I'll put an asterisk here that it can be in some ways, but there are some limitations. But you can look at routes, you can look at shared state, you can do a lot of things you can do in Vue inside these components. You can also turn any component into a server component at any time, which makes it very flexible. But there's a catch, right? So nothing's perfect. And so there are some things that you need to be aware of if you use server components today. Nuxt server components inside your application. So first, one of the most obvious ones, since you're running on the server, you don't have access to the DOM. So the document object model is not accessible. So if you're trying to do some stuff with the window object, that's not going to work, and you'll need to find a better way of doing that. You also have no lifecycle hooks. So if you're trying to use some sort of use mounted, things like that, that doesn't work. It has top level async await. So in a server component, it will wait until those things happen. And we'll talk about that for a moment, but you don't need to wrap everything in like a use, any kind of lifecycle hook. And I'll say there's no interactivity with the star here. So you can't use things like ref and reactive inside a server component. It just won't work correctly. So there's ways of adding some interactivity, but maybe that's not the best use case for a server component if you're trying to have a very something that has a lot of interactivity with it. So let's take a look at how to set up server components. So it's really straightforward to do this inside Nuxt today. And what you just need to do is make sure you have a running newer Nuxt app that has node 18 or higher. And then also, I believe as of 3.6 or higher. And you need to make sure that you have some components in there, and you'll need to rename them to server.vue, which I'll show you in a second. And then you need to turn on this experimental feature, and it's called component islands. Not to be confused with Nuxt islands, if you guys have heard of that, but it's just the name of the experimental feature. All right, so what does that look like here? I have a Nuxt config. I would need to go into it, add this define Nuxt config, and then experimental, and then add component islands true in here. And this is all you need to do to add in this feature. I would recommend too, if you are watching this, check out some of the other experimental features that Nuxt has. You can always go into this experimental, and since it's TypeScript aware, just take a look at them and see if any of them interest you, because there's quite a few. And this really helps the Nuxt team determine where they should put some of their resources if people are using these things. There's also an open GitHub issue on this with a future roadmap. And if you have any issues, you can always add a request in there and provide some feedback. So inside your components, you just change it to .server.vue. So that's all you need to do. You just add the .server.vue extension, and you have now created a server component. And it kind of looks like this. So it looks like this is a very contrived, simple example, but assume that we're creating a user profile component that has to connect to some third-party backend. Maybe it's using some libraries to grab some data to display a profile. You can still use you can still use props. So I passed in a profile name. I also could do some more calculations and maybe do some more interesting props here. But this is it. It's basically a component. And that's it. And then from there, we have gained some greatness because now our app bundle is smaller. Anything in that user profile component that we had in there, any libraries, are now all going to be on the server side, and that's going to save us some time next time our users come to our website and download it. But you're probably thinking there's no interactivity, right, in this whole process here. And you would be right, but let's take a look. One way we might be able to get around that. So here is slots. So slots are one of my favorite features in Vue. I love how you can just place information everywhere. You can kind of mix your parent and child component information together. And this is available inside Nuxt server components today, which is great. It wasn't at one point, but they've added it in. So let's go back to our simple example of our user profile component. Now we have this div right here. default slot here, and anything between the opening and closing brackets of this user profile component will be rendered inside the default slot. So you just add a slot inside this user profile component and it will work. And what's more is you can also have a little bit more flexibility. Just like normal slots, you can add in this top, so you can have name slots in here. You can even have scope slots. So it gives you a lot of flexibility. And so if you want to add in some interactivity to your app, you wouldn't want to put it inside the server component. You would put it inside this slot here. So we can add a button in here. We can add in whatever kind of interactivity, client activity one, and then it'll be inserted directly inside this user profile component, which is pretty awesome. By the way, as of this recording right now, I did see a slight bug where I was getting a hydration mismatch error on the client when this happens. I did talk to a few people, and I believe that will be fixed. But I just want to mention, if you do get a hydration mismatch error, that's being looked at. What about async server components? So this is an interesting idea. So what happens if we have a component that has some sort of call to a backend resource that has some milliseconds or seconds delay? So how is the component going to load? And now, if you're from the Vue world right now, you're probably thinking of suspense and how that works. But we actually have a different way you can handle this inside Nuxt server components. So we call it non-blocking server components. I actually did a video on this a while back, and I want to say that that this was an issue I had at the time, and they have released this new feature in the last couple of months that helps fix this issue, which is really nice. So imagine a scenario, you're going to a website and your server component needs to contact some backend resource, pull some information in. Now you want to make sure that the web page loads, that it just doesn't hang there, and non-blocking server components helps with that. So what does that look like? You first add a lazy prop to it, and this is a Boolean. You can put true or false on it, and if it's true, then it will be lazily loaded, so it doesn't block the route or component from loading. And then you can put a fallback message. So this is a slot that you can put in, so the user can put in that it's loading or tell the person what it's doing. So here's what it looks like. So this is a server component. Let's imagine it's going to some example endpoint doing a fetch, and it's going to take like 30 seconds to load. And obviously you don't want this user to just be waiting there for this server component to load. What you can do is you add in first this lazy true inside here, and this will tell it basically to load this server component lazily as the response and promise is resolved. And then we can have a template fallback where we can put a message like loading async component in the background. And so here it is. So look, this fallback is a slot that has a name slot. Basically, fallback is the message in here. Of course, I just put text, but you can put a whole anything else you want inside there. So that's a lot to cover. They are adding features all the time for Nuxt server components. I think they're hedging their bets. The core team on Nuxt is to see how popular this feature is, if people want more of it. Like I said, certainly if you're interested in this, I would look at some of the GitHub issues and contribute to them, put your feedback on what you want to see in the future. But there was a couple different features I saw on the roadmap that I thought looked interesting. So they're going to have more interactive components within server components. More ways to be interactive with inside them is an important feature that they're looking at and seeing how people are using it. They're also looking at deeply nested components and how interactivity works with them. On the Nuxt side, it's a lot different than the React server components I talked about at the beginning of this video, where they've kind of defaulted it to that. And you have, in the React side, you have this deeply nested structure where you have React server components, and then you have like client components as leaves on a tree underneath it, while it's almost the opposite on the Nuxt side, where instead of the Next side, where you can have individual components be React server components, but you might have deeply nested ones, and they're trying to look at how that works and how interactivity works with those interactive components. And then they're also looking at some more slot refactoring, stabilization. A really good example is maybe you want to use this with Nuxt content, and they want to make sure that there's resources and that everything is stabilized, the API that works everything. So those are a few features that are on the roadmap as of today. So thank you for watching. I just want to thank Daniel Rowe and Daniel Kelly for both giving me some feedback on this presentation and helping me out. And I will put some links to their content in the video description below. Let me know if you guys want to see more videos like this where I kind of deep dive in with presentations. I think it's pretty fun. Let me know. Thanks.